People are more willing to admit that they think something's off or they were distracted or they can't find something because they know they have technology around to help them find it. And so, that kind of also brings this culture of transparency and communication that is so important for them as well as the patients.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we're speaking with Hannah Elmblad, Director of Customer Excellence at Stryker. Melanie, we're going to be talking about bringing technology into the operating room where processes are still quite manual, such as surgical counts.
I'm excited to talk about this because counts are a big part of what we do. We have to count every procedure, every case, every time. Anytime we're going to be doing anything invasive, we have to count to make sure that we keep track of everything that we're using, and anything that can make that a more streamlined process, anything that can make it more guaranteed that everything is correct, I think it's great. So I'm excited to talk about this topic today and really dive into what technology can do for us.
All right, we're going to be right back with Hannah Elmblad, Director of Customer Excellence at Stryker. Don't go anywhere.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Hannah Elmblad, Director of Customer Excellence at Stryker. And Hannah, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You are welcome. I'm so excited to be here.
So, Hannah, can you talk about your background? Tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe even something fun that you like to do with your free time.
With my free time. So, bonus question. All right. So, yes, my name is Hannah, and I am with Stryker. I've been with Stryker for over 12 years. I graduated from college and went directly there. So, I am from the Surgical Technologies business unit. It's the business unit that has the journey to zero. If anyone has seen that, that's kind of our claim to fame. But we primarily work with nurses, and we work on nurse technology and innovations to make nurses' lives better. That's kind of our focus in our business unit. And so I'm just really excited to be here. It's something we really look forward to doing and talking about. A little bit about me. I am from California. I was originally raised in the Bay Area, and I went to Cal Berkeley. So go Bears, if there's any Bears out there. I am a mom of two. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I know you can't see me, but I have red hair. And my 4-year-old looks exactly like me. So now that I have a look-alike, I'm not having any more children. That is the plan there. And then something I like to do, well, I just moved to Michigan. So I've stopped doing as much outside because of the polar vortex we live in. Let's see. I do like to go snowboarding. I'm going to say that. That's very California. I like to go snowboarding. I'm really bad. I learned in my 20s. That's not when I recommend learning how to snowboard. But let's go with snowboarding.
All right, we'll take it. I mean, it is kind of a swing. You're used to that same temperature all year long in the Bay Area, and now you've got really cold coals. And now, I don't know if you've been there in the summer yet, but during the summer, it's very nice in Michigan.
I've had one summer, and that's what apparently we live for. So I've gotten one summer, and now I'm back into winter, and I'm looking forward to vacation somewhere else.
You know, I don't know if where you lived in California was the same as for me when I lived in California, but everybody always talked about going to the snow. Like that was a thing. You went to the snow. You didn't live with the snow. So I can definitely see that being an adjustment for you to going where you actually have snow in winter and lots of cold.
Yeah.
The snow comes to you. You don't go to the snow.
Yeah. It was easily escapable. And then once we started driving in it, it was a shock. So, yep, I'm doing it. I'm snowboarding. We're making the best of it.
All right, so the kind of theme for today's show is surgical counts, but we're going to be tying in technology into this whole conversation. So, Melanie, why don't you start with what you just love about surgical counts, and then we'll talk about the current state with Hannah.
Okay, well, surgical counting can be challenging. You have the case going on around you and you're trying to set up and you have to get everything counted ahead of time. But then when it's time to close, you have your surgical tech or your scrub nurse still trying to pass instruments, still trying to run a back table and a Mayo stand, but you still got to count this stuff. And surgeons don't like to stop and they don't want to wait for you to count. And God forbid you tell them they got to hold up because we can't find something. And so there's just a lot of factors that go into counting, and also maybe an awareness and an understanding that what you're doing actually is important. It's not just something we have to do to get a check in the block, but like we really want to make sure there's nothing left inside this patient, and we can have a lot of distractions that prevent us from counting correctly, and then we're digging through the trash trying to find something we missed or whatever. So while counting is very important and definitely something we all need to make a priority, counting can be challenging at times just given the environment that we're in and the speed at which we go on a daily basis in a case.
Yeah, room turnover. You've got to be keeping things going, and you definitely don't want to find a missing instrument and delay that. That can really set the whole rest of the day back. And as you said, God forbid that were to happen in first thing in the morning. So as we bring technology into this conversation, Hannah, anything you want to add to sort of the current state, some of the challenges that, Melanie talked a little bit about there, but would you add anything? And how would you paint that picture?
When we look at it, and we're not necessarily the nurse, but we talk to a lot of nurses and we try to listen. And I think my biggest takeaway, what's going on right now, is people want to do better. Nobody wants to have a retained surgical item or a retained surgical sponge. We've heard a lot of people say that it's their worst nightmare to have a retained sponge or to harm a patient any way, shape, or form. And so when we look at it, it's just like people want to do better. There's not just this general complacency right now with sponge counting, but it's like Melanie was saying, it's really hard. And so, as a vendor here in this space, we take it really seriously that we've got to do something to help make that attainable. And then the other thing is just the exhaustion. And I think it's the turnover, it's the exhaustion, it's the staff changes. It's not easy to get a protocol in place, let alone get technology to help you and actually apply that across an entire health system, OR, hospital, you name it. It's a lot to even swallow. So I know people want to do better. They want solutions, but it's a real challenge right now. And being a number one Sentinel event, we've got to do better out there.
It can also be really challenging from a leadership standpoint, too, to enforce a protocol or to enforce an actual system that everybody follows, because you get nurses and scrub techs in the OR who've been doing things the same way for 20 years or however long they've been there, and they are resistant to change, and they might not understand why how we've always done it maybe isn't the most effective. Kind of like what you said with surgical counts. I mean, they're a sentinel event. We don't want that to happen to our patients, and maybe holding on to the status quo of how we've always done it isn't the most effective way to do that. And maybe there are ways to explore and then implement new ways to make sure that we're keeping our patients safe.
It was crazy. With the Redonda case that came out, I think it was in March or May of 2022, correct me if I'm wrong. And that had a lot of opinions on both sides. But it was just a very obvious situation where you had this potential criminalization of a nurse who made a mistake. And, there's lots of nuances to that case and whatnot, but I think that's another area where we have just realized that, we don't want nurses to make mistakes, but also they're starting to live in fear that, there's going to be some type of holding accountable for this criminal situation. And that's sad. Like we want nurses to be confident. We want them to be happy. Like we don't want to be living in a state of fear. And so I think that's another area where we just want people to be more successful at their jobs, but to also be able to, sleep peacefully at night. So I think it's the fear thing that has really escalated recently and is very interesting.
So it's funny that you mentioned fear, because as I was preparing for this episode, I actually pulled up the AORN guideline for prevention of unintentionally retained surgical items. And they give you this whole introduction. And this is a huge guideline, by the way. And I'm going through it. And even in the very first page of the guideline, it said that there was a survey that was conducted that included 3,137 responses from perioperative registered nurses. And 61% of the participants identified the prevention of retained surgical items as one of their top priorities for perioperative patient safety. So they recognize that it's a risk, and they recognize that it's something that they want to make sure that they're looking out for so their patients can be safe. I mean, it's a pretty high percentage of people that recognize this particular subject as what they want to make sure that they're protecting their patients from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and we can talk about this later too with AORN, but they have made a concerted effort and an entire Center of Excellence program for retained surgical items, starting with retained surgical sponges. And, they're all in. So I think it's a message from AORN and from the nursing community that they want to do better and we need to help them do better.
That fear thing is a real issue because it's hard enough to get nurses coming into the profession right now. You talked about kind of the stress and the staffing situation that we're in, but it's even harder to get them to go into peri-op, to find the right fit for peri-op. So, we've already got an issue with nurses, but how do we get them to go, into the surgical setting and then again to scare them away? And I think pretty much anybody in surgical services has concerns about doing a good job in a low staffing environment. I mean, anybody would, even outside of that, but there's other support departments, et cetera. And in some cases, I feel like we bring a lot of new technology to the table, but bringing technology to the areas that are still manual is just got to be what happens from this point forward. And we could talk about like return on investment, et cetera, but I still want to hear, some more stories about retained surgical instruments. Like, how does that manual, we put so much training and focus on it. It's almost like hand washing for the surgical services, in that when you go to nursing school, you go over hand washing over and over and over and over. And, in surgery, it's very much the same with surgical counts. It's so over and over and over. It's regimented, trained in, and yet these mistakes still happen. So what do you think is at play there?
Yeah, I mean, we have all sorts of statistics, so does AORN, but 1 in 8 cases results in a false correct count. And it can go a lot of different directions. It's really interesting. Me coming into this business unit, you talk a lot about safety, but there's also just stress and time saving. Like sometimes there's a false count that you're off, but really the sponge is there. And so it's not always like in a patient's body. It's not always going to prevent some type of patient harm. Part of it is just saving time and improving people's workflow and reducing their stress load when a sponge does go missing. And so it's been interesting coming into this space from a technology standpoint. Like we are so patient centric, but when you look at all of the challenges that go around sponge counting, there's a lot more at stake than just patient care. It can be, the longest 2 minutes of your life while you're trying to find a sponge. And so there's endless stories. I'm sure Melanie has some. I have some too. But we hear about a lot of things that save them from the mental stress of even trying to locate, not just finding a sponge inside of a patient.
It is stressful. I mean, when you have your count, you're trying to reconcile it. And we're not always counting instruments. We don't count instruments every single case. It depends on the procedure. But sponges, needles, soft goods, those things are being counted every single case, all the time. And sponges are really probably the most retained item out of any of the items that are reported. So we have surgical sponges that are being retained even on counts that are put down as correct in a manual count, which does make you nervous. But I've had multiple times where I've completely stopped a case and been like, no, you cannot sew anymore. You have to stop because we can't find this. We don't know where it is. I've pulled in other people to help. We've gone through the trash. We've gone through multiple times in the trash, all the stuff on the back table, all the trays, wherever. And we found sponges in the weirdest places. The attending surgeon went ahead and left before the resident closed. And when he had a sponge in his hand and he pulled it out inside his glove and threw it away. And so you're not only going through the trash, digging through all of the bloody drapes, all of the stuff that might be in there, but unwrapping dirty gloves so that you can find a sponge inside them. I mean, weird places. But then at the same time, we have also had to make a surgeon stop before and insist that they manually view the cavity because we cannot find it. And they argue and say, no, it's not there. We know it's not there. And finally, when they do, sure enough, it's there. Like, we have had cases where we have found it inside the patient, but we've had to insist that they look for it because they have argued with us that it wasn't there. So then when you're not only, you have that stress of trying to find it and you can't, and then you have the added stress of having to argue with someone to prove, no, you really need to find this. There's a lot of emotional, almost trauma sometimes that can come into that experience, and people, maybe they're afraid to argue. Maybe they won't argue. Maybe they won't stand their ground. And then what does that do for the patient when they roll out of the room later and there is a sponge or something else inside of them? It's terrifying to just be depending on just our manual ability to count or our ability to say, yeah, I saw it, it's not there. So I guess that's maybe my soapbox. I should hop off of it. But I've been in too many cases, too many times where we've had problems and it's stressful. And if you don't know what to do or don't have any backup, It's hard.
It's funny you say the sponge was inside of someone's glove. That is so common, and it's hard to find. And it wastes a lot of time, and time is money. And, we'll talk about, what are some ways to get technology, but think about all of those things that are really important to a hospital and really important to their staff. And it's so funny. We just heard one just the other week, because our sales reps, when we find a sponge, whether that was in the trash can or in a patient, we celebrate it just the same, because it's okay, yeah, great. We found it. And the surgeon had apparently taken some sponges. They had opened up a pack and they had kind of removed some sponges from the other. And the surgeon thought that they were up for grabs, which is kind of a weird situation to start. And so he went and put them in his backpack, or they were somewhere in the far corner of the room, just not in a place that you would ever look. And sure enough, when they went to go do the count, it was off. And, the manual count, and part of technology is also locating. So it's not just the count side, it's locating. And so, they would have literally have never found it, and they would have had to have x-rayed, They would have had to have escalated. And sure enough, the reader helped locate it. But they were what, why on earth did you put this in your backpack? What are you trying to do to us? And so it becomes also this training moment, and it becomes this okay, hey, even though we found it, awesome. Let's find out why we even ran into that situation in the first place, instead of making it so adversarial. And people are more willing to admit that they think something's off, or they were distracted, or they can't find something, because they know they have technology around to help them find it. And so, that kind of also brings this culture of transparency and communication that is so important for them as well as the patients. And so, they're kind of funny in hindsight, but I'm sure in the moment when this person couldn't find this sponge, they're losing their mind, right? So, and then, of course, it's the surgeon, not the nurse. So an interesting kind of ending there, but yeah, stories all the time.
Yeah, legit had the same thing happen. I had to track down a surgeon because he grabbed a stack of 5 laps off of the back table when he left. Because they hadn't been used, so he just took them. I don't know. But he took them, and they were in his office. I'm like, dude, I can't reconcile this count with 5 laps in your office. You can't do this. Right. Whatever. So yes, been there, done that, lived that experience as well. So, oh my gosh.
It's interesting the way I think you were talking about the operational impact that technology has to help give us insights and guidance, instead of getting caught and the finger pointing until we figure it all out. And then, all of that stress and even the cultural damage to the relationships has happened, or, to the trust that somebody has in somebody else on the team. It doesn't really matter, who caused the issue, that stress buildup to identifying who swears that they didn't do anything, can really erode at that team building. So you feel like technology kind of depersonalizes that situation, gives you data, and resolves faster so that just the integrity of the team can be maintained and intact as well?
Yeah, I mean, a couple different thoughts there. I think one is it validates the count. And so where someone, I can't remember, it was Melanie or Justin, you were saying, the surgeon's like, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's fine. Or like, I'm sure it's in the trash. Like, it validates that there's a problem. And so I feel like when you are easily able to clearly say there is a miscount, it's not that I did it wrong. It's that there's a miscount. We all have a problem. So like, let's work together to resolve it. And I feel like it takes some of the like, are you sure? Are you sure? Like, what if out of the equation? And it just very clearly signifies we have a miscount. We all need to work to resolve it. And so I think it definitely gets everyone back on the same team. And then, and we say all the time, technology does not replace the manual count. I mean, that is AORN's, like, if they could tattoo their foreheads.
Right.
It would say,
yep. I actually highlighted it in the guideline. Does not replace
the manual count. It doesn't replace the manual count. And so there are so many benefits to your workflow, to being able to do the process consistently, and then to have everyone that's in the OR suite on the same page. And so I think that's what it does. And so, there's always going to be conflict. I think that's unavoidable. But when everyone is working in the same direction, like, at least we can resolve it and the case doesn't move forward. And so I think that's what we've seen.
How do these technologies work?
Yeah. So there's a couple different options out there. Okay. So there's the find aspect, there's the count aspect, and then there's an option out there that does both find and count. So if we start with find, okay, so that would be like RF technology with a wand where you're kind of just waving it over the patient to verify that there's nothing inside the body. A lot of people have different thoughts on, how much that can be trusted and whatnot, but that is, let's all be honest, it's a step in the right direction. And so, it's using that technology really just to find a sponge. So if you were to have an improper count, you can move forward with some type of finding technology. Then you have count. So this is when you have your sponge that has some type of tag on it. There's two different types of tags. The first would be barcode. And this is kind of the simpler, like a starter version, and it's used for counting. So you can actually scan in those sponges in their packs, and it will essentially say 5 are in the system. You can scan another. Now there's 10. And then at the end of the case, you can scan them out. So it is helping you with the count. All right. But the actual sponge, right, doesn't help you with locating or finding. So now there's a new system out there and it does both. So you're able to scan your sponges so it can do your count in as well as your count out. And then it has a reader now where if you do have a missing sponge, you are able to locate. And it looks like a barcode scanner at the grocery store. And it uses the same kind of noise as a metal detector. So it's hot and cold. If you can't hear anything, you're really cold. As you get closer to the sponge, it's going to start beeping more frequently. And it's going to give you a light. If it's really loud in the OR, you're going to see a light that also tells you how strong the signal is. That's kind of the way technology works today. You can either find, you can count, or you can do both find and count.
I guess the other thing for me, a lot of times when you're trying to bring in these technologies, it's like trying to, especially in the tight financial situation that healthcare is in right now, is how do you justify that? And sometimes the time saved and the efficiency, you go to whoever's kind of holding the purse strings and they say, well, that's kind of colloquial, right? Like, that's soft savings. That's not hard savings. And then, you're saying, well, what if you have a retained surgical item, how much that costs your organization. And, just one or two of those would pay for the system, right? Like say things like that. And then they're like, yeah, but we don't really have a problem with retained surgical items. So why would we buy a technology? And then that's what eventually leads us to this point where things are purchased like this kind of technology after the event happens instead of staying forward thinking and bringing in that technology. How do you make that argument? If somebody's out there listening and they're like, I think this technology would be great for us, but maybe they're not in a management position, or maybe they are, they've been frustrated because they can't get it approved in the budget. What's the conversation there?
Well, hey, when you come up with the perfect answer to that question, you let me know. we would love to know ourselves, because it's true. You're kind of trying the anything that sticks strategy. And I think it's very account dependent on what is going to actually get them across the line. I would say, from my perspective, being with a vendor, there are a lot of powerful, positive activities that AORN does or other societies. And I think more than just hearing like, hey, I think this is really cool technology. It's like, hey, let's look to the experts and what they are recommending. There's no way that they are putting a bunch of resources on creating a center of excellence and they are awarding publicly these facilities that are making these commitments to this space if it is not important that we follow suit. And I think we call it like an angry mob mentality where, a lot of people choose to be vocal. If you can't find the one person that the decision maker is just going to all of a sudden say, this sounds great. We have a lot of customers that buy this technology immediately after a very negative event. So we do talk a lot about staff retention as well. I think that's one where a lot of people want their staff to be retained at this point because people are burnt out and they are exhausted. And it is at the point where it is unsafe. And so we encourage our reps to just have a conversation with as many people as possible on what is the safety story? Why is having this conversation important? And, how are they planning on protecting their staff? And so, we'll throw out quotes about litigation and whatnot, but I think another thing, not to get on my soapbox, but the other thing is comparing it to like Go Clear and smoke evacuation. That was a nice to have 10 years ago. And that has 100% moved to legislation. In the next 10 years, it will be required that you are evacuating smoke, and retained surgical items or sponges are on the exact same trajectory. They're just a few years behind. So I think it's about like, hey, are we doing this? And are we going to do this, proactively with everyone? Or are we going to be one of the people who does it on the back end after we've made a bunch of really painful mistakes?
I'm just thinking, you said 1 in 8, right? So let's just pretend for a second that 1 in 8 cases is a minor incident, right? That's usually what it is. And maybe it costs you 5 minutes. Okay. So I'm going super conservative here, but how much is the cost of an OR minute? What is it? $300 a minute? Is that what it is now? I feel like it's something like that.
It's gotta be in the thousand. I don't know. I mean, it's like,
hold, please, I'll look it up.
Yeah. Look that up while I work the math. Cause if you do, like 30 cases a day, on average, right? So now still not a big hospital, and we're only talking 5 minutes of delays, but you take that cases, that means that there's nearly, if it's 1 in 8, there's nearly 1,000 cases for a facility that does 30 procedures a day, statistically speaking, that could cost them 5 minutes. So if we multiply that out by 5 minutes, we're coming up on almost 5,000 minutes of potential efficiency from being able to verify and do that quickly. So whatever the cost of the OR minute is.
So according to a previous guest, Michelle Lemons, in an article that she wrote in 2020, it averaged out to $62 a minute on average in the OR.
Okay. 62 minutes on average. I kind of inflated my number. Even at that, for a hospital that does 30 procedures a day, if you could save that 5 minutes every 1 in 8 cases where this comes up, you'd save $300,000 a year. That's how I look at it. Just looking at the math, like, I think all of a sudden the technology starts to seem like a pretty easy decision in many cases, I think. So, Hannah, what final thoughts do you have?
You know, I encourage everyone to also really think about the implementation side. I think it's interesting. I manage one of our implementations teams, and there are so many people that are excited to do this, but the change management side of it is really intimidating. And when you find a vendor who can come alongside of you and say, hey, like, we are absolutely on the same page. This is going to be a lot. Everyone has to use it once we go live. So you're going to have some people who are not interested or question it, or just, it might be slow to start with. Like, to have a very realistic partner in actually doing this is so important, because we recognize that. And we want to help you guys through it. And we want to be there every step of the way. And we don't want to leave you with technology and some hope and dream, but no ability to actually execute it, because it's expensive and it's important. And so when I think about these areas, like, I just think about how much you have to put on training, how much you have to put on, having certain people identified as super users, having, your surgeon staff on board with the fact that we're learning a new system, and making that as positive and as transformative as possible. Like, that is something that we are just so passionate about, because technology is cool. Okay. Check. Got it. But it's gotta be used and it's gotta be impactful. And we've just recognized that the implementation side of it and the change management coaching that goes along with that is just as important as getting the right equipment in there. And so I just encourage everyone, like, be your own advocate and be prepared to find a vendor who's going to do it with you.
Yeah. I've always said, if people understand the why behind why things are changing and why we are doing things, and the why in this case goes back to patient safety and how manual counting cannot necessarily be confirmed all the time. And we still have mistakes even when counts are correct. So helping our staff, helping our coworkers, helping our team understand the why behind the need for a technology to help confirm a count, I think would go a long way in that change management and help see a positive change in our operating rooms.
Hannah, great job. Thanks so much for coming on, and great work, and keep bringing tech into the operating room.
We are on it. Hey, we started with Neptune, designed by a nurse for a nurse. So we keep going forward. We love this stuff. So thank you guys for having me.
That was Hannah Elmblad, Director of Customer Excellence at Stryker, and we're talking about using adjunctive technology to help us improve areas such as surgical counts, and specifically the prevention of a retained surgical item. But even then, just when we're not sure, how much time does that take for everybody to get it right and be comfortable, case is over, and making sure that somebody doesn't go home with a sponge or any other instrument still inside their body, Melanie?
Gosh, it's just, I'm almost at a loss, because it's so important to make sure that our patients are safe. Their patients are entrusting us to take care of them and to give them a safe surgical experience. And the risk of a retained item of any kind is a very real risk. And then studies show that even with manual counting, those aren't always correct. I mean, several times the counts are incorrect, even though we have on paper that it was correct. And so that peace of mind, not only for the patient, knowing the patient's okay, but also for staff, knowing that they didn't have an error if they have technology to confirm that their counts are correct. I think that's huge. And I think it's a big improvement for just staff and patients in the operating room.
Yeah, I think peace of mind, right? Peace of mind is something that you just can't have enough of these days. All right, that's going to do it for this week's show. I do want to remind everyone to find us on LinkedIn and Facebook, find our posts, engage with us, reach out to Melanie and I on LinkedIn. Go ahead and send us a message. Give us some feedback on how you're enjoying the show, or if there's a particular topic that really stood out to you. Another way, if you don't want to be so publicly visible on social media, sending us feedback, you can send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. And then you can find us on Apple, Amazon, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio, Spotify, really any podcast application. But the best way to listen to this show is to download the smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And while you're there, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review. On behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.